Hello class, welcome to this week's lecture. We're going to be focusing on printmaking for this lecture. And I basically want to focus on a few important questions that come up with your discussion this week. So I posted a variety of videos that you can watch on different techniques for printmaking, along with the PowerPoint from the book. So that should help you to kind of get through the material as you're reading the chapter from your book. But this PowerPoint will focus specifically on screen printing so we can get more at the question that is posed in your weekly discussion, which is all about originality and what happens to the unique original when artists are able to print the same piece over and over and over. So this is just an image from the inside of Andy Warhol's studio, which he actually called the factory, and we'll get to that in just a second. But basically this lecture will focus just on screen printing because this will be within the context of our chat about Andy Warhol and originality. So just to give you some context on screen printing, this is basically a very popular type of printing nowadays. A lot of your t-shirts that you're wearing are probably screen printed. I particularly like this lecture because my parents are actually small business owners and they have a screen printing and embroidery business. So I am a trained screen printer, so I know how to make all those prints on your t-shirts. But if you look at your t-shirt right now that you're wearing, it's most likely been screen printed in some sort of screen printing factory. And here's the process. It's very similar to how artists would be making screen prints as well. So here's kind of the process of screen printing in a kind of a small shop where you see 4 different heads with 4 different screens. That means there's probably 4 different colors that are going to be used. And as it would go around, each screen would be pressed onto the shirt. The shirt, of course, doesn't move. And then you squeegee the ink going through the mesh screen onto the shirt. And this would be a small operation, but typically larger shirt shops would have this done not manually, but automatically by a giant machine. But this is very similar in some ways, the manual part of it, to what we see artists doing with printmaking today, in the process of printmaking. And so here's a kind of an image from an artist in their studio where they've created a print on a screen like so. And so basically screen printing was invented, it was an early Chinese art and then spread to other Asian countries. But it's not really until the 50s and 60s that we have it becoming popularized within fine art circles in America, and that's very much because of the pop artists and specifically Andy Warhol. He's a great proponent of that. But it's not until then that we really see it popping up in America. But basically what we've got here is a screen that is covered and in some sort of mesh. And so you have a type of mesh, and it originally was made out of silk, and that's why it's called silk screen. But nowadays, people will commonly use polyester or some other sort of synthetic type of screen, a mesh screen through which some sort of ink is pressed. So you can see here, this artist has his ink. He would put ink up at the top and then decide how much he desired to go through the screen, and then he presses the squeegee down all the way back here to the bottom of the screen, and then the parts of the screen that don't have kind of a blocking agent or that haven't been emulsified will let the ink go through while the rest of the screen does not allow the ink to go through. So that's how you have your print, and here you can see the print comes through the screen onto the t-shirt here. Very similar process with the artwork as well. Basically, you need a single screen for every color, so if you were an artist working with 4 different colors on a print, you need to have 4 different screens that were almost exactly the same, but they would have to be slightly different depending on which colors you wanted to go through with different parts of the print. Alright, now let's talk a little bit about originality. So, what about originality? How does printing make us rethink the notion of the original print? So the thing about printmaking which allows it to differ from the artists that came before, is that you can make multiple prints all at once, right? You can use the same screen and make hundreds of prints with the same screen, just going through the process over and over and over. And so you can make all sorts of prints very quickly and sell these in mass. And so this is very kind of an automatic process, similar to the process that you would find in a factory, right? Factories make our shoes, they make our water bottles, they make basically everything around you. They can make it relatively quickly, right? Because you have a factory setting where everything is automated. And so that brings us to the question of the genius, right? The master artists. How is the genius of the artist's masterpiece challenged by the art of printmaking? The other question I want to pose is there anything less original about prints? What happens to the notion of the original artwork? And does the role of the artist change in terms of printmaking? So here you see Andy Warhol in his studio. He's right here. He also has an assistant. You see here helping him work. And then what I want to do right now is to give you a better context of Andy Warhol and the kind of character that he was. I want to show you a quick video clip. So let me pull it up for you. So here it is, and we can actually see him working in his studio while he's being interviewed.
Andy, what do you think about television?
I love television.
You like being on television?
No, I just like to watch soap operas.
The daytime kind?
Yeah. And the morning kind.
Morning kind. Does that go back to the time you used to listen to the old radio soap operas?
Oh, yeah.
But you don't much like appearing on television yourself?
No.
Or painting on television, as you're doing right now?
No.
Well, just for the sake of the audience, you might say that what he's doing is a screen painting of an electric chair, I believe, right?
Yeah.
What made you think of doing electric chair?
I just think they're beautiful.
Beautiful?
Yeah. Yeah, oh, yeah.
I think you've come to represent pop art more than maybe anybody else. What is pop art anyway? How would you define it?
Oh, can you ask higher than that?
Yeah, they usually ask me these technical questions, you know. I suppose if you had to make a definition, it would be painting or sculpture that revolved around commercial imagery or industrial images. Signs and symbols from the everyday life, things that you see all the time, repeated interminably, done in a sort of very stylized way. Usually the images themselves don't come from an actual subject. The artist takes the image from somebody else's reproduction, somebody else's depiction of it. Usually a photograph or a movie clipping, something from a magazine usually. That's probably the closest you can get to a general definition. Familiar images.
Yeah, well, most of us are aware of what the critics have said about it. One of the things they say is that, well, they say different things, but one of the things they say, Andy, is that this is sort of anti-art or art without feeling or what have you. You get an emotional kick out of seeing these things that you do. I mean, seeing them original. For instance, you have that big Elvis Presley thing. You like Elvis Presley movies, for example.
Oh, yes. Well, just because there's something to do every day. I mean, that's the reason we do
it. Andy, what do you think?
All right, so the thing that I like about this video is that it allows you to actually see his process and kind of how nonchalant it's become. He's also using an assistant. He had a variety of assistants, screen printers, who would help him with his printing because his work became in such demand that he needed to create large amounts of work to make sure that he had enough to supply demand, right? And this is interesting because this is the way that we usually talk about consumer products, right? Factories are creating products in mass to supply the demand for these products. A similar thing was happening here with his art, and he's very aware of that, and so he's actually making prints while he's being interviewed. The other thing that I find very interesting is his character itself. He was kind of a quiet guy. He didn't really like to answer questions from interviewers, and as you can see here, it's very classically Warhol moment when he says, I don't want to answer that question, which basically the question is, what is pop art, right? What is this movement that you've become the icon for? And he says, no, no, you can ask my assistant. He handles that, right? So for him, it's a much more about the process, um, not about answering those technical questions, dealing with reporters and people who want to talk to him, but doing the work itself and being in some ways a machine that creates art in mass. So this brings me back to the question of originality. So is this art? That's a question we can maybe think about. I think a lot of my students would say, I don't know. It doesn't seem like it, right? It seems more like advertising. What is different about this piece of art, for instance, the Campbell Soup cans? How is this different from a piece of advertisement for Campbell Soups, right? Um, does this need to be in a museum to be seen as art? What if you saw this in the marketing department at the Campbell Soup's headquarters, right? So there's some important questions that are happening here that have to do much with advertising and context and how we actually see this as becoming art. And it really does change the process is very different than it used to be, right? To be a master artist. So let me move this up here so it's not in the way. So look at the process here that here's Andy again in his studio, which he actually called the factory. So he was very much aware of the fact that he was working like a machine. His process for creating his work was very machine-like. It was automated, much like everything in our culture. Um, for instance, here's a photographer I'd like to bring up when I talk about consumerism, and Andres Gursky. He was working contemporarily and since the 80s and 90s, and he documented consumerism. And so Andy was interested in objects around us, right? Everything around us is made in mass. Everything around us is made in a factory. It's really hard these days to even go anywhere and get something that is unique, right? You go to the store, oh, there's hundreds of that candy bar. You can just have one. It's not homemade at all, right? Same goes for other consumer goods. Here's another photograph by the same artist where we have the layout of all these different electronic devices. So we have, what are these called? I'm blanking on the word. It must be pregnancy brain. Oh my goodness. It's a heating iron, that's what it is. And then we have vacuums right behind and all sorts of consumer goods that are all, coffee pots in the back. And this is what you see typically in a store, right? You go to a Walmart or a Target, and everything that's there, there's 10 of them on the shelf. There's, probably 50 of them in the store in the back. And then how many stores are there in McAllen, right? And so what's interesting here is how this connects to this kind of interest in consumerism and automation and factory, and the factory making consumer objects becomes very similar to the process that the artist employs as he creates his work, which is completely different, right, than what we see with the masters, the quote-unquote masters within the art world. So here we have Leonardo da Vinci, a unique one-of-a-kind piece, working with the Mona Lisa. There's only one of these, right? Of course, you can go and buy a print of it somewhere, but the original print is in the Louvre in Paris, France, behind bulletproof glass with security guards. And this is the only one that exists. And the process for this artist was very, very different, right? Leonardo da Vinci sat down, it took a very long time to paint this, sat down with the woman who he painted it of, had her sit for him. This took him a very long time. And this is original, right? Is the only piece that exists that is actually the Mona Lisa by the artist in the real medium in paint from 1503. So it's very different for Warhol and what we see here with his works. And so that's the kind of question that I'm interested in bringing up, is kind of how does the process change for the artist and become much more interested in mass culture, production, consumerism, and the factory itself. So for instance, here we have a portrait, of course, by Andy Warhol, the gold Marilyn Monroe. This was done soon after she died, after she committed suicide. And another thing I like to bring up here is technicality and skill. And so think about the amount of skill that the artist Leonardo da Vinci had to have to render the figure so lifelike, to paint her in such a manner. Same goes for the landscape. So there was a lot of time put into this piece and a lot of skill that had to go into it, right? He was a trained artist. He trained for years as an artist. He was very talented in this way. But then we have kind of, and they talked about this in the video, we almost have the anti-art over here on the left. If you think about skill and technicality, Andy Warhol was not interested in taking a long time to create his works. And that's the thing about a screen print, is literally you can do a print in a matter of moments and be done with it. There's not really an interest in skill or technicality. The artist was actually trained. He did go to school for art. He worked in advertisement and did have a degree in art, but that's not what's of interest here. Rather, it's consumerism itself, and actually, I would say death. This is part of his a series that had to do also with death and dying, and this is right, as I said, after Marilyn Monroe passed away, and so it becomes a kind of memorial portrait to her. Creating, well, she was an icon already, but really memorializing her even more as an icon with this gold background. But there's really no interest in perfection, right? All of these colors that are kind of smacked on top of her face, they don't really fit correctly into registers, and there's really no interest in detail here. But rather, that's not what was the artist was interested in at this point. And so think about that. Think about those questions. Think about the things that you that might come to mind for you as you're thinking about the questions that are brought up with your discussion this week. And the other thing I just like to bring up as well is that even though we do have this real interest in consumer culture, and it's really difficult for us these days to find anything that's homemade, right? Everything is bought. Everything, as I look around me, you might look around yourself now, as I've said, and see all sorts of things that are made in China, right? And there's thousands of them that are made and shipped everywhere. But then we do have a recent kind of DIY revolution that seems to be happening within the recent years. There's websites online. Etsy is kind of the best known one for now, but I've even heard they've started to kind of capitalize on the DIY revolution. But there's this idea that someone who makes something that's homemade can sell their objects online. So getting back to basics, right? Making sure that not everything is made in a factory. But then again, Etsy as well is perhaps starting to sell out in certain ways. But I'll stop there. This is just kind of a mini lecture getting you to think about this question of originality in the print. I look forward to hearing what you have to say about that and how you interact with one another within the discussion post. I hope you have a great week, and I will speak with you next week.